somewhere, without even knowing your name. Someone is slowly becoming the kind of person who will one day be grateful that you exist. Not because you're perfect, not because you'll rescue them, but because you'll arrive in their life carrying something they've been quietly asking the world for. Maybe patience, maybe safety, maybe the feeling of finally being understood. And if that sounds strange, it's probably because you're too busy noticing everything you think is missing in yourself. Before we go any further, if conversations like this help you feel a little more understood, subscribe and stay with me. There are some thoughts we don't get many chances to talk about. I wonder how many nights you've looked at your own life and thought, I'm running out of time. Not always about age. Sometimes it's about hope. You watch people fall in love. You watch friends get married. Someone announces another engagement. Someone else posts smiling photos from a vacation they took with the person they adore. And without meaning to, you quietly compare. You don't even feel jealous. You just feel forgotten. Like everyone else received an invitation to a future that somehow never reached your mailbox. Most men don't admit that feeling. They'll joke. They'll distract themselves. They'll say relationships are overrated. Sometimes they even convince themselves they mean it. But late at night, when the room is quiet, the phone hasn't buzzed for hours, and there's nobody expecting them tomorrow, something inside whispers, I hope I haven't missed my chance. I've heard versions of that sentence so many times. Different words. Same ache. What fascinates me isn't the loneliness itself. It's what loneliness quietly does to the way you see yourself. It begins to edit your memories. Suddenly, every rejection feels connected. Every conversation that faded. Every person who left. Every almost relationship. Your mind gathers them together like evidence in a courtroom. See? There must be something wrong with me. But our minds are storytellers, not always historians. Sometimes they build a convincing story from incomplete pieces, and we believe it because we've heard it often enough. There's another possibility, one that's much harder to notice. What if your life isn't empty because nobody needs you? What if the person who will value what you've become simply hasn't crossed your path yet? That isn't wishful thinking. It's something I've seen happen more times than most people realize. A man spends years believing he's too quiet, too thoughtful, too careful. Then he meets someone whose entire life has been filled with people who never listened. Suddenly, the thing he called a flaw feels like relief to someone else. Funny, isn't it? The qualities you apologize for sometimes become someone else's answered prayer. But there's something almost nobody notices before two people recognize each other. Life often has a strange way of preparing both of them separately, and that's where this becomes far more interesting than it first appears. I've noticed something over the years that doesn't get talked about enough. People often imagine love as two strangers accidentally finding each other, but in many cases, it feels more like two separate journeys quietly moving toward the same intersection. Neither person can see it yet. You're learning things you never asked to learn. Patience after disappointment, calm after chaos, how to stay when it's uncomfortable, or maybe how to finally walk away when staying only hurts. At the time, none of it feels meaningful. It just feels exhausting. You keep thinking, why do I have to keep going through this? And that's such a human question, because pain always wants an explanation. Imagine a man who spent years trying to earn love by becoming whoever other people wanted him to be. He agreed too quickly, apologized too often, ignored the little moments when his own needs disappeared. He wasn't weak. He was afraid that if he stopped giving, people would stop choosing him. Now imagine a woman whose life looked completely different. She wasn't looking for someone louder, or richer, or more exciting. What she secretly longed for was someone whose kindness didn't come with hidden expectations. Someone who could care without keeping score. Neither of them knows the other exists. Not yet. But life is shaping them in ways that only make sense later. That's one of the strange things about timing. We usually judge it while we're still inside it. Only afterward do we understand what it was doing. Still, there's something that quietly gets in the way. Not bad luck. Not fate. Expectation. Sometimes you become so focused on meeting the right person that every new conversation turns into an interview. Every date begins carrying the weight of your future. Every silence feels dangerous. Every delayed reply feels like another prediction coming true. And without realizing it, you stop meeting people. You start measuring them. There's a difference. People can often feel it, even if they can't explain why. You've probably met someone who seemed desperate for things to work. Not because they were a bad person, because they needed this one connection to fix everything they were feeling inside. That's a heavy role to hand another human being. Most people quietly step away from it, not out of cruelty, out of instinct. Real closeness usually grows where there's enough space for curiosity, enough room for two people to slowly discover each other instead of immediately trying to decide whether they're each other's forever. I think that's why some relationships begin so unexpectedly. Not because someone finally learned the perfect words, not because they mastered attraction, but because, for the first time in a long while, they weren't trying to convince someone to stay, they were simply being present. There's a quiet confidence in that, not loud confidence, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself, and people notice it, more than you think. But don't mistake this for pretending not to care. That's another misunderstanding. Some men hear advice about confidence and believe they're supposed to hide their feelings, become mysterious, act unavailable, play games. No. Emotional maturity isn't about becoming harder to reach. It's about becoming honest enough that rejection doesn't erase your sense of who you are. There's an enormous difference. One builds walls, the other builds peace. And strangely, peace has a way of drawing the right people closer. Because everyone is tired of performing. Everyone. Which brings me to something that still surprises me. Sometimes the person praying for someone like you is making the very same mistake you're making right now. They're wondering if they're too much or not enough. They're questioning whether anyone will ever truly understand them. And while you're both standing in different places, asking almost identical questions, neither of you realizes how close your paths may already be to crossing. There's a quiet moment that changes people. It doesn't usually happen during a first date or after some dramatic confession. It often happens when nobody is watching. A man is driving home alone. The music is playing, but he isn't really listening. He's replaying another conversation that went nowhere, another connection that faded. And for the first time, he doesn't ask, "Why wasn't I enough?" He asks something softer. Was I trying to become someone I don't even recognize? That question doesn't give immediate comfort. In fact, it can make you uncomfortable because sometimes you've spent so long chasing acceptance that you've forgotten what feels natural. You start editing yourself before anyone else has the chance. You hold back opinions, laugh a little louder than you feel, text back in ways that don't sound like you, pretend you're less interested or more interested. You become a version of yourself that's constantly watching itself. That's exhausting, and people often mistake that exhaustion for rejection, but they're not the same thing. I remember speaking with someone who told me, "Every conversation feels like an audition." That sentence stayed with me, because I think many men know exactly what he meant. You aren't just talking, you're wondering. Did I say too much? Should I have waited longer to reply? Did that joke make me seem immature? Was I confident enough? Meanwhile, the conversation itself has almost disappeared. Your attention isn't with the other person anymore. It's trapped inside your own head. Ironically, the connection you're hoping to create becomes harder because you're carrying the weight of constantly evaluating yourself. And here's what makes this even more interesting. The woman sitting across from you may be doing something surprisingly similar. In many cases, she's wondering whether she's being understood, whether you're genuinely listening, whether you'll disappear after seeing the parts of her she doesn't easily show. People often imagine attraction as confidence meeting confidence. Sometimes, it's simply two nervous people trying not to be misunderstood. There's something deeply human about that. We spend years believing everyone else has it figured out. Then life slowly reveals that nearly everyone carries invisible questions. Am I enough? Can I trust this? Is it safe to hope again? Those questions don't belong only to one gender. They belong to people. And maybe that's why the strongest relationships often don't begin with fireworks. They begin with relief. Relief that nobody has to perform anymore. Relief that silence isn't awkward. Relief that saying, "I had a difficult day," doesn't make someone pull away. Think about that for a moment. How rare it feels to relax around another person, to stop measuring every word, to stop wondering what image you're creating, to simply exist. That feeling. Many people spend years praying for it without realizing that's what they're actually searching for. Not perfection, peace. And here's something I find beautiful. The qualities that create that peace are rarely dramatic. It's remembering a small detail someone mentioned weeks ago. Listening without rushing to solve everything. Feeling comfortable enough to laugh at yourself. Being dependable in ordinary moments. None of those things usually make headlines, yet they're often what people remember years later. They become the reason someone says, "I felt safe with you." Those words carry more weight than most compliments ever could, but there's one obstacle that quietly keeps people from becoming that kind of presence. It hides so well that many never notice it, because it doesn't look like fear. At least, not at first. It often looks like protection. That's why it's so difficult to recognize. You tell yourself you're being careful. You don't want to get your hopes up again. You don't want another conversation that slowly disappears. Another message left unanswered. Another promise that quietly fades into silence. So you become cautious, reasonable, measured. At least that's what you call it. But sometimes that caution has another name. Fear. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that whispers, "Don't let them see too much." So instead of showing genuine interest, you wait. Instead of saying what you feel, you test them. Instead of asking the question that's on your mind, you hope they'll somehow read it in your silence. And silence is a strange language. Sometimes it creates mystery. More often, it creates misunderstanding. I wonder if you've ever walked away from someone thinking, maybe she just wasn't interested. While she was driving home wondering, maybe he didn't really like me. It happens more than people realize. Not because either person was dishonest, because both were protecting themselves from pain. It's almost heartbreaking when you think about it. Two people wanting the same thing, both waiting for the other to make it safe. I've seen this in the smallest moments. A woman notices the man keeps asking thoughtful questions. She likes that. She feels seen. She hopes he'll ask if she'd like to meet again. Instead, he smiles politely, says goodbye, and convinces himself that if she were interested, she'd make it obvious. She leaves believing he was simply being friendly. Neither person lied. Neither person rejected the other. Fear quietly translated both of their actions into the wrong story. Our minds do this all the time, especially after disappointment. Once you've been hurt enough, uncertainty starts looking like certainty. A delayed reply becomes proof. A distracted expression becomes proof. A cancelled plan becomes proof. Proof of what? Usually the story you've already been telling yourself. That's why two people can experience the exact same moment and leave with completely different memories. One thinks, "I embarrassed myself." The other thinks, "I wish he'd stayed a little longer." Neither knows what the other was carrying. This doesn't mean every missed connection was meant to become something beautiful. Some people truly aren't compatible. Some relationships end because they should. That's part of life too. But I do think many meaningful connections are lost long before compatibility is ever discovered. Not because love wasn't possible, because fear spoke first. Now here's the surprising part. The people who eventually become someone's safe place aren't fearless. They still feel nervous. They still overthink sometimes. Their hearts still beat a little faster before sending that message. The difference is smaller than most people imagine. They've learned that vulnerability isn't the opposite of strength. It's often the doorway to real connection. They understand that being seen always carries risk, but hiding carries one too. And if you hide long enough, the person who has been quietly hoping to meet someone exactly like you may walk past you without ever realizing they just missed the answer they've been praying for. Because the greatest tragedy isn't rejection. It's never allowing yourself to be recognized. And there's one final piece to this that almost changes the meaning of everything we've talked about. Most people spend years looking for the right person, without realizing someone else may already be looking for the person they're becoming. Maybe that's the thought I wanted to leave with you more than any other. Not that someone is guaranteed to appear tomorrow. Life doesn't make promises like that, but it does have a quiet way of surprising people who stopped believing they could be surprised. I've watched it happen, not in movies, not in perfect love stories, in ordinary lives. A man who almost didn't attend a friend's birthday because he was tired. Another who nearly cancelled a weekend trip. Someone who decided to say yes instead of staying home for the 100th time. Tiny decisions, nothing dramatic. Yet years later, those moments become the beginning of a story they never could have planned. It's strange, isn't it? We imagine life changing through huge events. Often, it changes because we walked through one door instead of another. But even then, the meeting itself isn't the miracle, it's recognition. You can stand beside someone for months and never really see each other. Then one conversation changes everything, not because new words were spoken, because both people were finally ready to hear them. That's why I don't think the question is only, when will I meet the right person? I think another question quietly matters just as much. If they met me today, would they be meeting the real me? Not the version constantly trying to impress. Not the version afraid to disappoint. Not the version pretending to need nothing. The real one. The man who laughs a little too hard when he's genuinely happy. The man who still gets nervous before opening his heart. The man who has been disappointed, yet somehow still chooses kindness, because that's rarer than you think. Some people lose their softness after being hurt. Others protect it. There's a quiet strength in protecting it, not perfectly, not every day, but enough that life doesn't turn your disappointments into your personality. And maybe you've underestimated how deeply another person could value that. You might think your calm nature is boring, your loyalty is ordinary, your patience goes unnoticed. Yet somewhere, someone may be exhausted by noise, by inconsistency, by people who say beautiful things but disappear when life becomes difficult. To that person, your steadiness wouldn't feel ordinary. It would feel like finally putting down a heavy weight they've carried for years. That's why I smiled when I said at the beginning that somewhere, someone may be slowly becoming grateful for a man they've never met. Not because they need saving, not because you complete them. Healthy relationships rarely grow from two incomplete people trying to fix each other. They often grow from two people who have learned something important through their separate journeys. That love feels safest when neither person has to earn the right to be treated with care. Maybe that's what you've really been preparing for all along. Not perfection, presence, not becoming someone else, becoming someone who no longer hides the parts of himself that deserve to be known. And if tonight, after this conversation ends, that familiar voice in your mind begins whispering, maybe it's already too late. I hope another thought quietly answers it. You don't know who is walking toward your life right now. Because somewhere, someone may be wondering if a man like you still exists. And without either of you realizing it, you may already be becoming the answer to each other's quietest prayer.